Please don't hurt me. I can't walk." Nora Castellano's voice trembled as she spoke those words. She sat in her wheelchair, trapped in Garrett Hayes's penthouse, looking up at a man who had every reason to hate her. Rain hammered against the windows. The sound filled the silence between them, heavy, relentless, like everything left unsaid. Garrett stood over her, his hand reaching forward. His jaw was clenched tight. His eyes were cold in a way that made her heart race with real fear. This was the man the business world called ruthless, the billionaire who crushed competitors without mercy, the single father who had sworn never to trust a woman again after his ex-wife destroyed him. And Nora had just broken into his home. She couldn't walk without her wheelchair, couldn't run if he decided she was the enemy, could do nothing but sit there and beg him to listen to what she'd risked everything to tell him. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered again. "I can't walk." Garrett's hand hung in the air. In one terrifying moment, she didn't know what he would do. 3 months earlier, Nora Castellano had been a different person. She'd walked into board meetings with her head high, commanded rooms with a single glance, and built Castellano Analytics from the ground up into one of the most respected data ethics consulting firms in the country. At 34, she'd proven every doubter wrong. She'd survived in a male-dominated industry, not by being louder, but by being smarter, more meticulous, more unshakable than anyone else. Then came the accident, or what everyone called an accident. It happened on a Tuesday evening in June. Nora was driving home from a late meeting, the kind that stretched past 9 o'clock because investors always wanted one more question answered, one more concern addressed. The highway was nearly empty. She remembered the music playing softly through her speakers, something classical she'd put on to unwind. She remembered checking her mirrors, signaling to change lanes. She didn't remember the truck that sideswiped her car at 70 miles per hour, sending her spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before slamming into the concrete barrier. She didn't remember the paramedics cutting her out of the wreckage, or the helicopter ride to the hospital, or the first surgery that lasted 11 hours. What she remembered was waking up 3 days later with a doctor standing beside her bed, his face carefully neutral, telling her about the spinal trauma, the fractured vertebrae, the nerve damage that might be permanent, the wheelchair that would be her companion for the foreseeable future, possibly forever. Nora had stared at the ceiling and felt something inside her crack open. Not her spine. That was already broken. Something deeper. The part of her that had always believed if she just worked hard enough, stayed vigilant enough, controlled every variable, she could protect herself from disaster. The doctors called her recovery miraculous. She could move her legs, feel sensation, even stand for short periods with support. But walking more than a few steps left her in agony, her body betraying her with tremors and weakness. The wheelchair wasn't a choice. It was survival. The insurance company ruled it an accident. A trucker fell asleep at the wheel, they said. These things happen. The settlement barely covered her medical bills, but Nora knew better. She'd spent her career analyzing data, finding patterns in chaos, seeing connections others missed. And in the weeks after the crash, as she lay in her hospital bed scrolling through files on her laptop, with hands that still shook, she found the pattern. The trucker who hit her had been paid, not by his company, by a shell corporation that traced back to a name she recognized, a name that made her blood run cold. Declan Frost. She'd met Declan 7 years ago, back when she was still building her company, still hungry and naive enough to believe that talent and integrity mattered more than connections and ruthlessness. He'd approached her at a conference, charming and polished, offering partnership opportunities that sounded too good to be true. They were. Nora had discovered he was running a massive fraud scheme, siphoning money from clients while cooking the books to hide the theft. She'd confronted him privately, told him she was going to blow the whistle, report him to the authorities. Declan had smiled at her, a cold, patient smile. You could do that, he'd said. Or you could walk away and forget you ever saw anything. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. I'll bury you so deep, no one will remember your name. Nora had been young then, scared. She'd walked away. Rebuilt her career far from Declan's orbit, told herself she'd made the pragmatic choice, that one person couldn't fight a system that corrupt. But Declan hadn't forgotten her. And when she'd started making noise about corporate ethics reform, writing op-eds that called out the kind of behavior men like him thrived on, he'd decided she needed to be silenced permanently. The accident wasn't an accident. It was attempted murder. Nora had spent months gathering evidence, cross-referencing financial records, tracking shell companies and offshore accounts. She'd found the paper trail, the payments, the phone records that proved Declan had orchestrated her crash. But she couldn't take it to the police. Not yet. Because the deeper she dug, the more she realized Declan's conspiracy went far beyond her. He'd spent a decade building a network of destruction, planting people in companies to sabotage them from within, orchestrating hostile takeovers through proxies, destroying competitors and witnesses alike. And his latest target was Garrett Hayes. Nora had learned about Garrett through the same investigation. She'd discovered that Garrett's ex-wife, the woman who'd married him and then abandoned him and their son after a brutal divorce, hadn't been random. She'd been recruited by Declan, paid to seduce Garrett, marry him, have his child, then traumatize him with a calculated abandonment designed to break him emotionally. Why? Because Garrett's cybersecurity company was a threat to Declan's operations. Because Garrett was brilliant, principled, and wouldn't be bought. So Declan had decided to destroy him another way, by making him so bitter, so distrustful of women that he'd become a weapon. A ruthless corporate raider who crushed companies without asking questions about who was really pulling the strings behind the hostile takeovers, including Nora's company. Hayes Corporation was moving to acquire Castellano Analytics. Garrett thought it was a smart business move. He had no idea he was being manipulated into finishing what Declan's truck driver had failed to do, destroying Nora completely. That's why she'd come to his penthouse that night, because she had evidence that could free them both. Audio recordings of Declan coordinating her accident, financial documents proving the conspiracy, emails showing the decade-long manipulation. But she needed Garrett to believe her, and that meant facing a man who hated women, who saw manipulation in every interaction, who had built walls so high around his heart that even his 6-year-old son couldn't fully reach him. Nora had rolled her wheelchair through the rain to his building, used credentials she shouldn't have had to bypass security, taken the elevator to the penthouse floor. She'd knocked on his door knowing he might throw her out, knowing he might call the police, knowing he might do exactly what he was doing now. Stand over her with cold eyes and clenched fists while she begged him not to hurt her. But she'd come anyway, because sometimes the only way forward is through the thing that terrifies you most. Garrett's hand was still frozen in the air between them. The rain continued its relentless drumming, and somewhere in the apartment, his son Finn laughed at something on the television, the sound so innocent it made Nora's chest ache. "You think I'm like him?" Garrett's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "You think I'd hurt a woman in a wheelchair?" Nora forced herself to hold his gaze. "I think you're angry. I think you don't trust me. And I think you have every right to both of those things. But I need you to listen. Please, just listen." For a long moment, Garrett didn't move. Then, slowly, his hand dropped. Not to strike her, to pick up her phone from where it had fallen on the floor when she'd flinched away from him. He held it out to her. His expression was unreadable. "Talk," he said. "You've got 5 minutes before I call security." Nora took the phone with shaking hands. 5 minutes. It wasn't enough time to explain everything, to show him all the evidence, to make him understand the scope of Declan's betrayal. but it was a start. 7 years ago, she began, her voice steadier now, I met a man at a conference. His name was Declan Frost, and he's been destroying lives ever since. Garrett's eyes narrowed. The name clearly meant something to him. Keep talking. So she did. She told him about Declan's fraud, about the threat that had silenced her, about the years she'd spent looking over her shoulder. She told him about the accident that wasn't an accident, about the months of investigation that had led her to a horrifying truth. He planted your ex-wife, Nora said, watching Garrett's face carefully. She didn't meet you by chance. She was recruited specifically to marry you, have your child, then leave in the most devastating way possible, all to break you, to turn you into someone who'd do his dirty work without realizing it. Garrett's jaw tightened. That's insane. Is it? Nora pulled up files on her phone, turned the screen toward him. Look at the dates. Look at the financial records. She received payments from one of Declan's shell companies starting 6 months before you met her. Payments that continued through your marriage and spiked right before she filed for divorce. Garrett stared at the screen. She watched his face shift from skepticism to something harder. Something that looked like the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Why would he do that? His voice was hoarse now. Because your company threatened his operations. Because you couldn't be bought or intimidated. So he decided to break you another way. By making you hate women so much that you'd crush companies like mine without asking why. Without realizing you were finishing what his attempted murder started. Garrett looked at her then. Really looked at her. She saw the moment his perception shifted, when he stopped seeing an enemy and started seeing a person. Someone who'd been hurt as badly as he had. Someone who'd risked everything to tell him the truth. Show me everything, he said. They spent the next 2 hours in his study. Finn had gone to bed, tucked in by a nanny who asked no questions about the woman in the wheelchair occupying Garrett's attention. Nora spread her evidence across his desk, documents, recordings, timelines that traced Declan's conspiracy back a decade. Garrett went through it all with the methodical focus of someone who'd built a cybersecurity empire. He cross-referenced her findings with his own files, things he'd gathered during his bitter divorce when he'd suspected something wasn't right but couldn't prove it. The pieces fit together with sickening clarity. He did this, Garrett said finally, his voice flat. All of it. My marriage, my son growing up asking why his mother didn't love him. Your accident. He looked up at her. He tried to kill you. Yes. And now he's using me to finish the job. Nora nodded. The hostile takeover of my company. If it goes through, I lose everything I rebuilt after the accident. My livelihood. My purpose. He wins. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk, one with a lock that looked serious, and pulled out a folder. I've been investigating my ex-wife for 2 years. I knew something was wrong, but I could never prove it. These are my files. If we combine them with yours, we'd have enough to bury him. Nora finished. To go to the authorities, to stop him from hurting anyone else. They looked at each other across the desk. 2 people who'd been strangers 3 hours ago, who'd been enemies in the corporate world, who now shared something deeper than either had expected. A common wound. A common enemy. A chance at something like justice. There's one problem, Garrett said. If Declan realizes we're on to him, he'll destroy the evidence. He has connections everywhere. Police, judges, media. We'd need to move fast. Hit him all at once before he can cover his tracks. We have maybe 48 hours. Nora agreed. Once he realizes I'm not at home, that I came here, he'll know something's wrong. Garrett stood, started pacing. She could see him thinking, calculating, planning. This was the man who'd built an empire, the one who saw 10 moves ahead in every negotiation. "We need more than evidence," he said. "We need leverage, something that makes it impossible for him to wriggle out of this, even with his connections." "Like what?" Garrett stopped pacing, looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Like going public. If we release everything simultaneously, to the press, to law enforcement, to regulatory agencies, he can't suppress it all. The story becomes too big to bury. It was risky. It meant exposing themselves, their vulnerabilities, their pain to public scrutiny. It meant trusting that the system would work, that justice would prevail, when both of them had learned the hard way that the world didn't always work that way. But it was also their best shot. "Okay," Nora said. "Let's do it." They worked through the night. Garrett's security team, people he trusted absolutely, helped them compile everything into packages for different outlets. Major newspapers, television news networks, the FBI, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They prepared a coordinated release, timed to hit all at once so Declan couldn't get ahead of the story. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, Nora's pain medication wore off. She tried to hide the tremors, the way her hands shook as she typed. But Garrett noticed. He always noticed. "You need to rest," he said. "We don't have time. We have enough time for you to take your medication and rest for an hour." His voice was firm. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Nora wanted to argue, but the pain was making it hard to think clearly, and she knew he was right. She took her pills, let him help her transfer from the wheelchair to his couch. He brought her a blanket without being asked, adjusted the pillows so she could lie comfortably. "Thank you," she said quietly. Garrett nodded. He didn't say anything, but something in his expression had softened. The walls he'd built so carefully were showing cracks. When Nora woke, pale morning light was filtering through the windows. She could hear voices in the kitchen, Garrett's low rumble and Finn's higher, excited chatter. She smelled coffee and something sweet. Pancakes, maybe. She pushed herself upright, reached for her wheelchair. Her body protested the movement, stiff and sore from sleeping on a couch, but the pain was manageable. She rolled toward the voices. Finn saw her first. His eyes went wide with delight. "Dad, the lady's awake!" Garrett turned from the stove, spatula in hand. He looked exhausted. They'd only slept a couple of hours, but there was something different about him now. Less cold, more human. "Morning," he said. "Coffee, please." Finn bounded over to her, all 6-year-old energy and curiosity. "Are you staying for breakfast? Dad's making pancakes. He only makes pancakes on special days. Is today special?" Nora looked at Garrett. He gave a slight shrug, something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Yeah," she said to Finn. "Today's pretty special." They ate breakfast together. Finn chatted about school and his friends and a drawing he was working on. Garrett listened with the patience of a man who'd learned to treasure these moments, to hold on to the good things even when the world felt dark. Nora watched them and felt something shift in her chest. This was what Declan had tried to destroy: a father and son, a family struggling to heal. After breakfast, Finn went to get dressed for school. Garrett and Nora returned to the study, to the final preparations. "Once we release this," Garrett said, "there's no going back. Declan will come after us with everything he has, lawyers, PR firms. He'll try to discredit us, destroy our reputations." "I know. And we might lose anyway. He has resources we don't, connections that go deep." "I know that too." Nora met his eyes. "But we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth. And each other." She took a breath. "I can't do this alone, Garrett. But together, we have a chance." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Together. They sent the packages at 9 o'clock that morning. Every major outlet received them simultaneously. Within an hour, the story was breaking. Within 2 hours, it was everywhere. Declan Frost, respected businessman, revealed as criminal mastermind. Evidence of fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. The recordings, the documents, the testimony from 2 victims who'd survived his schemes and lived to expose him. The media firestorm was immediate and intense. Reporters camped outside Garrett's building, outside Nora's home, outside Declan's mansion. The FBI announced an investigation. The SEC froze accounts. Shareholders panicked. And Declan, for the first time in his decade-long reign of destruction, found himself cornered with nowhere to run. He tried, of course, held a press conference denying everything, claimed Nora and Garrett were bitter ex-partners with an axe to grind, promised lawsuits and criminal charges for defamation. But the evidence was too solid, too extensive, too damning. Within 48 hours, federal agents arrested him at his office. The charges read like a crime novel: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, a dozen other counts. Nora watched the news coverage from Garrett's penthouse. She'd stayed there, unable to navigate the media circus at her own home. They'd barely slept, barely eaten, running on adrenaline, and the grim satisfaction of watching justice finally catch up to a man who'd thought himself untouchable. When the arrest happened, Garrett was sitting beside her on the couch. Finn was at school, safe from the chaos. They watched the handcuffs click around Declan's wrists, watched him be led away in front of dozens of cameras. "It's over," Nora whispered. Garrett didn't respond immediately. Then, quietly, "Is it?" She looked at him, saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of everything they'd exposed, the truth about his marriage, the manipulation, the years lost to bitterness and mistrust. "The legal part is over," she said. "The rest, that's going to take longer." He nodded. They sat in silence, watching the coverage cycle through analysis and commentary. Experts discussing corporate fraud, psychologists talking about manipulation, survivors of Declan's other schemes coming forward now that it was safe. "I owe you an apology," Garrett said finally. Nora turned to him. "For what? For that first night, for standing over you like I did, for making you afraid." His jaw tightened. "For becoming exactly what he wanted me to be." "You stopped yourself," Nora said softly. "That's what matters. You could have thrown me out, called security, refused to listen, but you didn't. You chose differently. Because of you. Because you were brave enough to come here even though you knew I might hurt you." He looked at her then, really looked. "Why did you do that? Why risk it?" Nora thought about it, about the months of investigation, the evidence she'd gathered, the moment she'd decided to roll her wheelchair into a stranger's home and beg him to listen. "Because I've spent my whole career analyzing patterns," she said. "And I saw a pattern in you that gave me hope." "What pattern?" "You love your son. You protect him. You make him pancakes on special days and listen to him talk about drawings. You're not the monster Declan tried to create. You're a father trying to do right by his kid. That's the pattern I trusted." Something in Garrett's expression cracked then. The walls he'd built so carefully, the armor he'd worn for so long, all of it crumbling. "He did this to me," Garrett said, his voice rough. "Made me afraid to trust, made me see threats everywhere, especially in women, made me bitter and cold and—" He stopped. "I became someone I don't recognize, someone Finn deserves better than." "Then be better," Nora said simply. "You've already started." The media circus continued for weeks. Declan's empire crumbled. Companies he'd infiltrated were exposed. People he'd planted were fired. The scope of his conspiracy stunned even seasoned investigators. Garrett's ex-wife, faced with overwhelming evidence of her role in the scheme, took a plea deal. She'd testify against Declan in exchange for a reduced sentence. Garrett was offered the chance to see her, to hear her explanation in person. He declined. He told his lawyer to arrange supervised visitation for Finn, if his son wanted it when he was older, but he didn't need closure from a woman who'd never really been his wife. The woman he'd loved had been a fiction. Grieving her was grieving a ghost. The hostile takeover of Castellano Analytics was called off. Hayes Corporation released a public statement apologizing for the attempted acquisition, acknowledging they'd been manipulated. Garrett personally called Nora's board to assure them his company had no further designs on theirs. But in private, away from lawyers and press releases, something else was happening. Garrett and Nora kept talking. Started meeting for coffee, then for lunch, then for long conversations that stretched into evening. They discovered they liked each other, genuinely liked each other, when they weren't being manipulated into enemies. Nora met Finn properly. The boy was fascinated by her wheelchair, asked 1,000 questions with the innocent curiosity only children could manage. She answered them all honestly, told him about the accident, about learning to live differently, about finding strength in unexpected places. Finn thought her wheelchair was cool, asked if he could push it sometime. Drew pictures of them together, stick figures with exaggerated smiles. One day, 3 months after Declan's arrest, Garrett found Nora in his study. She'd been there more and more lately, working remotely from his penthouse because her own home still felt tainted by the memory of the accident, the months of fear. "I've been thinking," he said. Nora looked up from her laptop. "Dangerous." He smiled. A real smile, the kind she'd seen only occasionally, usually when Finn said something particularly clever. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." He sat down across from her, and for a moment he looked almost nervous. This man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, suddenly uncertain. "These last few months," he began, "having you here, working together, watching you with Finn, it's made me realize something." Nora's heart began to beat faster. "What's that?" "That somewhere along the way, you became the person I trust most in the world. The person I want to talk to about everything. The person who makes me want to be better." He paused. "And I don't want that to end. Garrett, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I know we're both still healing. I know trust takes time. But I need you to know, I want you in my life. In our lives. Not because of Declan or evidence or any of that. Just because you're you." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. "I want that too. But I need you to understand. I can't promise I'll ever walk normally again. I can't promise I won't have bad days where the pain is so intense I can barely function. I don't need promises about your body." Garrett reached across the table, took her hand. "I just need to know you're willing to try, to see where this goes, to build something with me that's ours, not something Declan tried to destroy." She looked at their joined hands, thought about the night she'd rolled her wheelchair into his home, terrified and desperate, thought about how he'd almost become the monster Declan wanted, how she'd almost given up on justice, how close they'd both come to losing everything. "Okay," she said. "Let's try." They took it slow, dated like normal people, though nothing about their situation was normal, went to dinners and movies, talked for hours about everything and nothing, learned each other's rhythms, fears, hopes. Garrett went to therapy, started unpacking the damage Declan had done, the ways his ex-wife's betrayal had twisted his view of women, of trust, of love itself. It was hard work, painful work, But he did it. For himself. For Finn. For the possibility of something real with Nora. Nora went to therapy too, worked through her trauma from the accident, the months of fear, the weight of carrying such dangerous knowledge alone. Learned to accept help, to lean on others, to believe she deserved good things even when her body didn't work the way it used to. They made mistakes, had arguments, struggled with intimacy and vulnerability and all the messy complexity of two damaged people trying to build something healthy. But they kept showing up, kept choosing each other, kept trying. Finn thrived. He had a father who was learning to be gentle again, to see good in people, to love without fear. He had Nora, who taught him that strength came in many forms, that disability didn't mean weakness, that families could be built from choice and commitment rather than just biology. One evening, almost a year after Declan's arrest, they were sitting in Garrett's living room, though it had become their living room, Nora having moved in gradually over months. Finn was colouring at the coffee table, working on his latest masterpiece. Garrett was reading a book. Nora was reviewing business proposals on her laptop. It was ordinary, domestic, peaceful. Finn held up his drawing. "Look, it's us." 3 stick figures, a tall one labelled Dad, a medium one labelled Nora, sitting in a careful rectangle that represented her wheelchair, and a small one labelled Me. They were holding hands, smiling exaggerated smiles. Above them, Finn had drawn a sun and written family in wobbly letters. Garrett looked at the drawing, then at Nora. She was smiling, that soft, genuine smile he'd learned to treasure. "What do you think?" Finn asked eagerly. "I think," Garrett said slowly, "that it's perfect." Nora reached over, squeezed his hand. They didn't need to say anything else. The drawing said it all. They'd started as strangers, became reluctant allies, survived a war together. And somewhere along the way, without really planning it, they'd become what Finn had seen all along. A family. Not perfect, not undamaged, but real. Built on truth and trust and the simple decision to keep choosing each other day after day, even when, especially when, it was hard. Outside, rain started to fall. Not the violent storm from that first night, but a gentle patter against the windows. Cleansing. Renewing. Garrett thought about that night sometimes. About standing over Nora while she begged him not to hurt her. About how close he'd come to becoming the man Declan wanted. About how her courage, her willingness to be vulnerable in the face of his anger, had saved them both. "Thank you," he said quietly. Nora looked at him. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to," she smiled. "You picked up my phone instead of being the person I feared you were. That was all the reason I needed." Finn, oblivious to the weight of the moment, went back to his colouring. Garrett and Nora returned to their quiet evening activities. The rain continued its gentle percussion. 2 years after that first terrible night, Garrett proposed. Not with fanfare or grand gestures, but with a simple question asked over breakfast while Finn built towers out of blocks. "Marry me." Nora looked up from her coffee. "That's not much of a proposal." "Marry me," he said again, pulling a ring from his pocket. "Not because it makes sense or looks good publicly. Not because Finn needs a mother figure or you need security. Marry me because I love you. Because I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and choose you. Because you chose me when I was at my worst, and I want to spend forever proving I can be my best. For you. For us." Nora's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the ring. Simple, elegant, exactly her style. Then at Garrett's face, open and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been capable of 2 years ago. "Yes," she said. They married in a small ceremony 6 months later. just close friends and family. Finn was the ring-bearer, taking his job with adorable seriousness. In his pocket, carefully folded, was his drawing of the three of them. His family. During the vows, Garrett took Nora's hands and spoke words he'd written himself. "You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's rolling your wheelchair into a stranger's home because the truth matters more than safety. You taught me that strength isn't hardness. It's staying soft enough to love even after you've been broken. You saved my life, Nora. Not just my company or my reputation, my actual life. The part that matters. And I promise to spend every day earning that gift." Nora spoke her own vows through tears. "You taught me that people can change, that walls built for protection can come down when it's safe. That family isn't what you're born into. It's what you build with intention and love. You gave me back my faith in goodness, Garrett. You and Finn. You showed me that survival isn't enough, that there's life after trauma, joy after pain, hope after everything's been destroyed. I choose you every day, forever." The officiant pronounced them married. They kissed while Finn cheered and their friends applauded. And later, at the small reception, Finn hung his drawing on the wall, right next to their wedding photos. Because this was the family he'd always drawn, the one he'd known they'd become even before they knew it themselves. That night, after Finn was asleep and the house was quiet, Garrett and Nora sat on their balcony. The city stretched out below them, lights twinkling in the darkness. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Nora asked. "All the time. Me too." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so scared, but also I knew. Somehow I knew that even though you were angry and hurt, you weren't the monster I'd feared. I saw it in your eyes, the struggle, the choice you were making." Garrett pulled her closer. "I almost made the wrong choice. But you didn't. That's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city breathe. Somewhere out there, other people were fighting their own battles, surviving their own trauma, making their own choices about who to become after being broken. Garrett hoped some of them would find what he'd found. Not perfection, not easy answers, but another person willing to see past the armor and fear to the human underneath. Someone brave enough to risk vulnerability in the face of anger. Someone who understood that healing wasn't linear, that some days were harder than others, that love was a choice you made over and over. "I'm glad you broke into my penthouse," he said. Nora laughed. "That's probably the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. I'm serious. If you'd given up, stayed safe, protected yourself, we wouldn't be here. Finn wouldn't have you, I wouldn't have you. Declan would still be out there hurting people. And if you hadn't listened?" Nora countered. "If you'd thrown me out or called security, if you'd stayed behind those walls, we'd both still be alone. So we saved each other. Yes, we saved each other." That was the truth of it. Not a fairy tale where one person rescued the other, but a real story where two broken people chose to face their demons together, where a woman in a wheelchair found her voice, and a bitter man found his heart, and a little boy got the family he'd been drawing all along. Years passed. Garrett's hair went grey at the temples. Nora's chronic pain never fully disappeared, but she learned to manage it, to work with her body instead of fighting it. Finn grew into a thoughtful teenager who carried his parents' values. Courage, honesty, the belief that people deserved second chances, into his own life. They built a good life together, quiet and ordinary in the best possible ways. Family dinners and homework help and lazy Sunday mornings, challenges and compromises, and the daily work of loving imperfect people imperfectly but completely. Declan Frost died in prison, largely forgotten. His empire had been dismantled, his co-conspirators brought to justice. He became a case study in business schools and law classes, an example of how unchecked ambition and lack of ethics could destroy not just others, but ultimately yourself. But for Garrett and Nora, he was barely a footnote. They'd moved so far beyond him, built something so much bigger than his attempt to destroy them, that mentioning his name felt like referencing ancient history. On their 20th anniversary, they returned to the penthouse where they'd first met. They'd kept it all these years, though they'd bought a house for their family. Sometimes they came back here for quiet weekends to remember where they'd started. That night, they stood by the same windows where rain had hammered during their first confrontation. It was raining again, as if the universe had a sense of symmetry. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Nora asked. "That first night, when I begged you not to hurt me." I said, "You think I'm like him?" Garrett's voice was soft. "I was so angry. Angry at you for breaking in, angry at the world for making me this person who scared a woman in a wheelchair. But you weren't like him. That's what I saw. You were struggling not to be like him. That's what gave me hope." Garrett turned her wheelchair to face him, knelt down so they were eye level. "You know what I see when I think about that night?" "What?" "The bravest person I've ever met. Someone who could barely walk, who had every reason to hide and protect herself, rolling her wheelchair into a stranger's home because the truth mattered more than her safety. You changed my life that night, Nora, not just by exposing Declan, but by showing me what courage really looks like." Nora's eyes filled with tears. Even after 20 years, his words could still undo her. "We changed each other's lives." "Yeah, we did." They stayed at the window for a long time, watching the rain, holding hands, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. From enemies to allies, to partners, to lovers, to spouses, to parents, to something that transcended all those labels. They were simply each other's person, the one who saw the worst and stayed, the one who knew all the broken places and loved them anyway. The rain began to slow, then stopped. The city lights reflected off the wet streets below, creating patterns of light and shadow. "I need to tell you something," Nora said suddenly. Garrett looked at her, concerned. "What?" "I'm still scared sometimes. That this is too good. That something will come along and destroy it. That I'll wake up and discover it was all a dream. That I'm still in that hospital bed 3 months after the accident. And none of this, you, Finn, this life, is real." Garrett squeezed her hand. "I know. I'm scared too. Every single day, part of me is terrified that I'll mess this up, that my old patterns will resurface, that I'll hurt you or Finn because I didn't heal thoroughly enough. But you don't let that fear stop you. No, because the alternative, living behind walls, pushing people away, staying safe but alone, that's worse than being scared. At least fear means I have something worth losing. At least it means I'm alive." Nora smiled through her tears. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the woman who rolled her wheelchair into my home and refused to let me hide from the truth." He kissed her forehead. "You want to know what I think about when I'm scared?" "What?" "I think about Finn's drawing, the one he made when he was 6. 3 stick figures holding hands. He saw what we were going to become before we did. And every time I doubt, every time I'm afraid, I remember that a child's innocent wisdom saw the truth we were too damaged to see. We belong together, the 3 of us. That's not a dream or a fantasy. It's just the truth." They sat together as the night deepened, as the city settled into its late-night rhythms, as the rain-cleaned air brought the smell of renewal through the open window. Somewhere in the apartment, their phones held dozens of messages. Business emails, dinner invitations, photos from Finn of his latest achievement at college. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, it was just them. Two people who'd met in fear and built something beautiful from the ruins of their trauma. Two people who proved that the worst moment of your life doesn't have to define you. That enemies can become family. That vulnerability is its own kind of strength. "Thank you for not hurting me," Nora said quietly. Echoing those first desperate words, Garrett pulled her closer. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be better." And there, in the place where their story began, they held each other and watched the city lights blur into something soft and beautiful, like hope made visible. Years turned into decades. Garrett's hair went completely white. Nora's body grew older, the chronic pain a constant companion, but she'd long ago made peace with it. Finn grew into a man who carried his parents' lessons, that courage meant choosing truth over comfort, that family was built through daily choices, that broken people could heal together into every aspect of his life. He brought home a woman he loved, someone who reminded Garrett and Nora of themselves in the early days, someone who'd survived her own trauma, who carried her own scars. They watched Finn navigate that relationship with the emotional intelligence they'd modeled for him, and they felt proud. On their 30th anniversary, they threw a party. Not a fancy gala, just a backyard gathering with the people who mattered. Close friends, colleagues, Finn and his partner. Someone made a toast. To Garrett and Nora, for proving that the best response to cruelty is building a life so beautiful that your enemies become irrelevant. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. But later, when the party had quieted and most guests had left, Finn approached them with something in his hand. "I found this," he said, unfolding a piece of paper carefully preserved in plastic. "My drawing from when I was 6, the one I made of us." Garrett and Nora looked at it. 3 stick figures holding hands, the word family written in wobbly childhood letters above them. "I remember the day I drew this," Finn said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember knowing, even though I was just a kid, that you two belonged together, that Nora belonged with us. I drew what I felt, not what I saw." "You drew what was going to be," Nora said softly. "You saw the future." "Maybe. Or maybe I just saw what you both needed, even when you couldn't see it yourselves." Finn looked between them. "Thank you. For being brave enough to become this. For giving me a home where love was real, where people didn't leave, where I could learn what it meant to choose someone every day." Garrett couldn't speak. He just pulled his son into a hug, then reached for Nora, bringing all 3 of them together in an embrace that felt like completion. They stood that way for a long moment. 3 people who'd become a family not through biology alone, but through choice and courage and daily commitment. The drawing between them, a prophecy fulfilled. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Garrett and Nora sat together in the gathering darkness. Fireflies blinked in the garden. The air smelled of summer and possibility. "We did good," Nora said softly. "We did." Garrett paused. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to my penthouse that night? If you'd been too scared, or if I'd refused to listen?" "All the time. And then I remember, I had to come. I couldn't have made any other choice, because the truth mattered more than my fear. And you couldn't have turned me away, not really, because somewhere under all that anger, you were still a good man. We were always going to find each other." "Like gravity," Garrett said. "Exactly like gravity. Massive forces meeting, creating something new from the collision." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd long ago run out of words that needed saying, who communicated in the spaces between speech, in shared glances and intertwined fingers, and the simple presence of being together. The evening deepened into night. Stars emerged overhead, and two people who'd met in the worst possible circumstances held hands in the darkness and knew, with absolute certainty, that every choice they'd made to trust each other had been the right one. "Please don't hurt me. I can't walk." Those words had started everything. Words born from fear and desperation, spoken by a woman who'd risked everything for truth. And the answer, the one that mattered, hadn't been spoken that night. It had been lived. Day after day, year after year. In every choice Garrett made to stay open. In every moment Nora chose to trust again. In every time Finn saw his parents demonstrate that love was action, not just feeling. The answer was, "I won't hurt you. I'll protect you. I'll stand beside you. I'll build with you. I'll love you. Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it." When Finn got married, he asked both his parents to walk him down the aisle. Garrett on one side, Nora in her wheelchair on the other, all three of them moving together toward the future. His bride's eyes were wet as she watched them approach, understanding without words what she was joining. A family built on the foundation of choosing love over fear. At the reception, Finn gave a speech that had everyone in tears. "My parents taught me that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up. It's about choosing each other when it would be easier to walk away. It's about looking at someone else's broken pieces and saying, 'I'll help you carry those.' They lived that truth every day of my life. And that's the kind of marriage I want to build." Garrett looked at Nora. She was crying, her hand tight in his. "We did that," she whispered. "We taught him that." "You did that," Garrett corrected. "That first night, when you could have stayed home, stayed safe. You taught all of us what real courage looks like." The years continued to pass, as years do. Grandchildren arrived, filling their lives with noise and chaos and joy. Garrett and Nora grew older, slower, their bodies betraying them in the way bodies eventually do. But their hands still found each other across dinner tables and in the dark of night. Their eyes still met with understanding across crowded rooms. Their love, tested by fire and trauma and time, only deepened. One evening, very late in their lives, they sat together in the same spot where they'd sat on their 30th anniversary. The garden was quiet. The stars were bright. They were both in their 80s now, Garrett in a chair beside Nora's wheelchair, their bodies fragile but their connection unbreakable. "I've been thinking about that night again," Nora said. "The first one, when I came to your penthouse." "So have I. I was so scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life. But I went anyway." "I know." "And you were so angry, so hurt. You could have been the monster Declan wanted you to be." "But I wasn't. Because of you." "Because of us," Nora corrected. "Because we chose each other. Because we decided that the truth mattered more than our fear. That healing mattered more than staying safe behind our walls." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "If I could go back and talk to that version of myself, the man standing over you, trying to decide what kind of person he wanted to be, I'd tell him something." "What?" "I'd tell him to reach for her hand, not her phone, her hand. I'd tell him that the scared woman in the wheelchair is going to become the most important person in his life, that she's going to teach him how to love again, how to trust again, how to be human again. I'd tell him that choosing her is choosing himself, the best version of himself." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "And if I could go back to that version of me, terrified and begging you not to hurt me, I'd tell her to look up, to really look at you. Because the man standing over her isn't the enemy. He's the partner she's been waiting for her whole life. He's the one who's going to stand beside her through everything that comes next. He's home. They sat together as the night deepened, as it had so many times before. The air was cool and clean. Somewhere in the house their family slept. Finn and his wife, their grandchildren visiting for the weekend. All the life they'd built together, all the love they'd chosen day after day after day. "I'd do it all again," Nora said softly. "Every scary moment, every painful step, every risk, I'd do it all again for this." "So would I," Garrett said. "Every single second." And that, in the end, was their story. Not a fairy tale where magic solved everything. Not a revenge plot where they destroyed their enemy and lived happily ever after. Just a real story about real people who chose, again and again, day after day, to love instead of hate, to build instead of destroy, to stay soft instead of hard. The story of a woman who rolled her wheelchair into danger because truth mattered more than safety. The story of a man who chose vulnerability over vengeance because love mattered more than being right. The story of a little boy who drew his family before it existed, who saw with a child's clarity what the adults needed to become. The story of 3 people who proved that families aren't born. They're built by people brave enough to heal together. "Please don't hurt me. I can't walk." Those words that had begun in terror had transformed into something else entirely. Into a marriage built on honesty. Into a family built on choice. Into a life built on the simple, radical act of showing up for each other, day after ordinary day. The rain that had marked their beginning came one last time on a quiet Tuesday evening. Garrett and Nora, now in their late 80s, sat together in their bedroom, watching the drops race down the window. "Do you hear that?" Nora asked. "The rain. It sounds the same as that first night." Garrett smiled. "Everything comes full circle." They were quiet for a long time, listening to the rhythm of the rain, feeling the weight of decades together. Their bodies were failing them now. Garrett's heart was weak. Nora's pain had intensified, but neither minded much. They'd lived fully. They'd loved completely. They'd built something that would outlast them. "Garrett?" Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah? Thank you for not hurting me that night. Thank you for choosing differently." Garrett took her hand, held it the way he'd held it thousands of times over the decades. "Thank you for being brave enough to give me the choice. Thank you for seeing who I could be when I'd forgotten myself." They fell asleep that way, hands clasped, rain falling softly outside, their breathing synchronized after so many years together. And somewhere in the house, on a wall in the study, hung Finn's childhood drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands. A family. Not perfect. Not undamaged. But real. Built by people who chose each other in the darkest moment and kept choosing each other until the very end. That was the story. That was love. Not the easy kind. The kind that costs you everything and gives you back more than you dreamed possible. The kind worth fighting for. The kind worth every terrifying, beautiful, ordinary moment. The rain continued to fall, washing the world clean, as it always had, as it always would. And in the morning, the sun would rise on a family built from the courage to whisper, "Please don't hurt me," and the grace to respond, "I won't. I promise. I choose you."